There is a sword in a stone, and only the true king can pull it free. You know this image, even if you've never read a word about it. A boy nobody believes in walks up to a blade buried in rock. A blade that has beaten kings, knights, the strongest men in the land, every one of them heaving at it and failing. The boy wraps his hand around the hilt, and it slides out like it was waiting for him. Because he was born to be king, and the sword knew it before anyone else did. That's King Arthur, the sword in the stone, the wizard Merlin, the round table where no knight sits above another, Camelot, the shining castle, the kingdom that was perfect for one brief moment and then broke. It's the most retold legend in the English language. It's under Excalibur, under Monty Python, under half the fantasy stories you've ever loved. All the way up to the boy pulls the sword, chosen one shape of Luke Skywalker himself. And here's the question that has driven historians slightly mad for 400 years. Was he real? Not the wizard, not the magic sword, but the man. Somewhere under 1,000 years of legend, was there an actual warlord, a real person of flesh and blood, and mud and blood, that this entire glittering myth was built on top of? The answer is one of the greatest detective stories in history, and it does not end where you think. This is Real Roots, the real history behind the stories you love. And today, King Arthur, and the very real, very desperate century of history the legend was ripped out of. Because to find the real Arthur, if he's there at all, we have to go to one of the darkest, least understood moments in the entire story of Britain. A moment when the lights, quite literally, went out. Let's go there. Let's start with an abandoned island. The year is around 410 AD, and Britain has just been left to die. For nearly 400 years, Britain had been part of the Roman Empire. Roads, cities, stone villas with underfloor heating, coins, law, soldiers, order. If you were a Briton in the year 400, you lived in a world that worked. And then Rome, crumbling, overrun, fighting for its own survival on the continent, pulled its legions out. All of them. And a Roman writer records that the emperor sent the Britons a letter, telling them, in effect, that they were on their own now. Look to your own defenses. We're not coming. Imagine that. An entire civilization, dependent on a superpower for centuries, waking up one morning to discover the superpower is simply gone. No army, no protection, and enemies circling every coast. This is the setup to Arthur. Not a fairy tale, a collapse. And it gets worse fast. Because Britain in 410 had walls, but no soldiers to man them. So the Britons did the thing desperate people always do. They hired help. They invited warriors from across the sea, fierce fighters from what's now Germany and Denmark. The peoples we'd come to call the Saxons, to come and defend them against raiders from the north. You can already feel the mistake, can't you? Because the Saxons came, and they looked around at this rich, soft, undefended island, the villas, the farmland, the people who had forgotten how to fight, and they made a decision. Why be paid to protect it when they could simply take it? The hired guards became the invaders, and the century that followed was, by every scrap of evidence we have, an absolute catastrophe for the native Britons. Towns abandoned, the Roman way of life collapsing into the mud, a whole people being pushed, decade by decade, off their own land, west and west and west toward the sea. And here, right here, in the worst century Britain ever had, is where a name first appears. Now, one thing before we go further, said once and said straight, because it matters, and then we move on. Almost nothing from this period is written down. The Britons were fighting for survival, not keeping records, and most of what little existed was lost. So the real Arthur, if he existed, lives in the gaps, in a handful of fragile, maddening sources written long after the fact. I'll show you each one, and I'll tell you exactly how much weight it can hold. That's the whole game. Let's play it. The first source is a monk named Gildas, and he's our best witness, because he was almost there, writing maybe a generation or two after the events, close enough to smell the smoke. Gildas describes the Saxon terror in vivid, furious detail. And then he describes something extraordinary. He says that at the darkest moment, the Britons finally found a leader, a man he calls Ambrosius Aurelianus, the last of the Romans, a survivor of the old order, who rallied the broken Britons and led them to fight back. And under this leader, or soon after him, Gildas says the Britons won. He describes a great British victory at a place called Mount Badon, a battle so decisive it stopped the Saxon advance cold and bought the Britons a whole generation of peace. A desperate people, a dark age, a last leader who rises up and wins one shining, impossible victory against the invaders. That's the shape of Arthur. That is exactly the shape of Arthur. But notice what's missing. Gildas, our best source, our closest witness, describes the victory. And he never once says the name Arthur. So either the greatest British hero of the age was left out of the only near contemporary account of his greatest battle, or the man who won Mount Badon had another name entirely, and Arthur got attached to the story later. Hold that fork in your mind, because everything hangs on it. Now we jump forward about 300 years, to our second source. And this is where the name finally lands. A Welsh monk called Nennius, writing around the year 830, compiles a history of the Britons, and in it, for the first time it survives, he gives us Arthur by name. He calls him a war leader, not a king, interestingly, but a battle commander who fought alongside the kings of the Britons. And Nennius does something a storyteller does. He gives us a list. 12 battles, 12 victories, Arthur at the head of all of them, culminating in Mount Badon, the same Badon Gildas described, where Nennius writes, Arthur personally cut down 960 men in a single charge. Now, 960 men, one man, one day. That is not history. That is legend already growing. The kind of thing you say about a hero, not a soldier. 300 years have passed, and Arthur is already becoming larger than life. But strip the impossible number away, and something stubborn remains. A written claim, from a real medieval source, that a war leader named Arthur led the Britons to victory at exactly the battle our best witness confirms actually happened. The frame is legend, but there may be a real man inside the frame. And then the frame takes over completely. Because 300 years after Nennius, a writer comes along who changes everything. And honestly, he's the reason you've heard of Arthur at all. His name is Geoffrey of Monmouth, and around the year 1136, he writes a book called The History of the Kings of Britain. He presents it as sober history. It is almost entirely invented. Geoffrey gives us the Arthur you actually know. He gives us the whole glittering machine, Arthur as a great king, not just a war leader. He gives us the wizard Merlin. He gives us Arthur's magical sword. He gives us the conquest of half of Europe. He takes a shadowy name from a war-torn century and builds him a crown, a court, a legend. And then French poets get hold of Geoffrey's version and add the rest. Lancelot, the love affair, the Holy Grail, the Round Table, Camelot. Layer after layer after layer, each writer polishing the story brighter, until the desperate war leader from the ruins of Roman Britain is buried completely under a mountain of gold. This is the single most important thing to understand about King Arthur, and it's the thing the movies never tell you. The Arthur you love is mostly medieval fan fiction. The knights, the Grail, the sword in the stone, Camelot, almost none of it comes from history. It comes from writers centuries apart, each one adding to a story that was already a story. Real history goes in as a monk's grim paragraph about a battle. It comes out 800 years later as Excalibur. We watched the exact same thing happen to a severed head on a platter in our video on the Red Wedding. Dry fact in, golden legend out. Arthur is that process running for 1,000 years. So peel all of it away. The magic, the knights, the castle, the French poetry. Peel it back to the one hard question underneath. Is there a real man at the bottom? And here the historians split into two camps, and I'm going to be honest about both, because this is the genuine cliff edge of what we can know. One camp says, no. They point out that our best source, Gildas, never names him. They point out that the name Arthur doesn't appear for centuries after the events. They argue that Arthur is what happens when a people who lost everything need a hero, that a defeated nation, pushed to the western edge of its own island, invented a golden king who beat the invaders, because the truth, that they simply lost, was unbearable. In this reading, Arthur isn't a man. He's a wound. He's the dream of the Britons who became the Welsh, nursing the memory of a victory that saved them for one generation, and a champion who might one day come back. Because that's the other half of the legend, and it's the half that tells you what Arthur really was to the people who made him. They said he never died. They said he was carried, wounded, to a mystical island called Avalon, the once and future king, and that in Britain's darkest hour, he will return. For centuries, the conquered Welsh genuinely believed it. Not as a metaphor, as a promise. Their king was coming back to drive out the invaders and give them their island again. That is not the belief of people telling a fairy tale. That is the belief of people who lost a war and could not let go. But the other camp, and this is where it gets interesting, says yes, or at least says something real is here. They argue you don't build a legend this specific, this persistent, around nobody. They point to that stubborn core. A real confirmed battle at Mount Badon. A real British fight back, in exactly the era the legend describes. Multiple independent sources circling the same name. They note that Arthur, almost unknown before this period, suddenly appears as a name given to several princes born in the generations right after. As if a whole culture were naming their sons after someone who had genuinely mattered, and recently. Their best guess isn't a king in a shining castle. It's something grittier, and honestly, better. A hardened part Roman British cavalry commander, riding out from the ruins of a collapsed empire, who won real battles against the Saxons, and held them back for a generation before the darkness closed in again. No Excalibur. No Camelot. A man on a horse in the mud, at the end of the world, winning a war everyone expected him to lose, and being remembered so fiercely that 1,000 years of poets couldn't stop adding to him. I can't tell you which camp is right. Nobody can. The evidence runs out exactly where the certainty would begin, and any historian who tells you they know for sure is selling something. But here's what I can tell you, and it's the thing that gives me chills. The legend and the history agree on the one thing that matters most. In the legend, Arthur is Britain's last best hope in its darkest hour, a light held up against the coming dark. And in the real history, buried under all the gold, that is precisely what the era needed, and precisely what the sources describe. Someone, with some name who stood up in the worst century Britain ever faced, and won, for a little while, against the end of the world. Maybe he was called Arthur. Maybe he was called Ambrosius. Maybe he was 3 different men remembered as one. The name washed away. But the shape of him, the last defender, the brief impossible victory, the light before the dark, that shape was real enough, and mattered enough, that a broken people spent the next 1,000 years insisting he would come back. And that's the final strangest truth about the sword in the stone. The story asks who the true king is, who gets to pull the blade free and save the land. And the real answer, the historical answer, is almost unbearably human. The true king was whoever actually stood and fought when Rome abandoned Britain and the Saxons came. We don't know his name. We may never know his name. But somebody pulled that sword. Because the Britons survived their darkest century, barely, bloodily, for one more generation. And someone real had to have made that happen. The magic is invented. The knights are invented. Camelot is invented. The Last Stand was not. This has been Real Roots, the real history behind the stories you love.